the house that ate its master. There is a mansion in America that survived by consuming the man who kept it. Where the battle for inheritance was fought not with honesty but with paperwork. Where signatures became weapons and authority became a commodity that could be transferred between hands like property itself. The house stood as it always had, immaculate, historic, preserved, while the man who had maintained it, who had lived inside its walls and attached his identity to its permanence, was systematically erased from its future. Not through violence, not through drama, but through documents that arrived at courtrooms and boxes, through legal maneuvers presented as protection, through the quiet machinery of trusts and foundations that rewrote ownership while calling it preservation. This was not a story of obvious villainy. There were no masked intruders, no midnight thefts, no guns or threats. There were only lawyers and heirs and trustees, people who spoke in careful language about fiduciary duty and proper stewardship, who presented themselves as guardians of legacy while they dismantled the very thing they claimed to protect. The mansion became a battlefield where the weapons were powers of attorney, contested wills, forged signatures, and the strategic control of an aging man's voice when he could no longer defend himself. The house survived. That is what they will tell you. The house was saved from being sold or subdivided or lost to taxation. It stands today as a museum, a historic site, a public treasure. But walk through its rooms and try to find the name of the man who kept it, who fought for it, who believed it would carry his family forward. You will find plaques that mention dates and architectural details. You will find tours that discuss the building's significance. But you will not find him, not in any meaningful way. His name was removed, his story rewritten, his claim to the place he devoted decades to maintaining quietly deleted from the narrative that visitors hear. This is what happens when a house becomes more valuable than the person who owns it. When preservation requires erasure. When the legal system designed to protect inheritance is weaponized to transfer control to those who know how to manipulate its mechanisms. The mansion survived because it betrayed its owner. And the betrayal was presented as salvation. This is the story of how paperwork can steal a legacy more effectively than any thief. How shame can be manufactured through legal process. And how a house can outlive its master by helping to destroy him. In the early decades of the 20th century, American law began treating estates not as family property but as public interest. The progressive era had taught the courts that concentrated wealth required oversight, that inheritance could not be left entirely to private arrangements, that the state had a role in ensuring that great properties served broader purposes than simply enriching heirs. This philosophy seemed noble in principle, preventing waste, protecting public goods, ensuring that historic property survived. But in practice, it created machinery that could be manipulated, legal tools that could be turned against the very people they were meant to protect. The mansion at the center of this story existed in a region where old estates carried particular weight. These were not the flashy palaces of new industrial fortunes but the established homes of families who had owned land for generations, whose names appeared on local institutions, whose presence in the community was taken for granted as part of the landscape. To own such a property was to occupy a specific social position, one that came with expectations of stewardship, of maintaining standards, of preserving something for future generations. This social context created vulnerability. A man who owned such a property could not simply sell it without facing questions about his commitment to family legacy. He could not let it decline without being seen as failing in his duty. He was expected to maintain it at standards that required constant capital, to open it occasionally for community events, to present it as something more than personal property, as a kind of trust for which he was merely the current guardian. This expectation seemed harmless, even admirable, but it meant that the property was never quite his in the way ordinary ownership worked. His control was conditional on meeting community expectations, and community expectations could be manipulated by those who wanted control transferred elsewhere. The legal landscape enabled this manipulation. Powers of attorney, once simple documents allowing someone to act on another's behalf, had evolved into complex instruments that could transfer nearly absolute control. Trusts, originally designed to protect assets from creditors or preserve wealth across generations, could be structured to remove an owner's authority while leaving him nominally in possession. Foundations, created as mechanisms for charitable giving, could be used to absorb private property under the banner of public benefit, and once property entered a foundation, the original owner's wishes became subordinate to the foundation's stated purposes. Geography mattered in ways that were not immediately obvious. The mansion existed in a jurisdiction where local courts had developed particular expertise in estate matters, where judges understood the community's interest in historic preservation, where there was precedent for intervening when families appeared to be mismanaging important properties. This legal sophistication created opportunities for those who understood how to navigate the system, lawyers who knew which arguments would resonate with which judges, trustees who knew how to present themselves as responsible stewards, foundation boards that knew how to frame property transfer as rescue rather than appropriation. The era's hypocrisy was profound. The same society that celebrated private property and individual rights had created systems that could strip both away through paperwork that looked legitimate because it was legitimate, filed in proper courts, signed by authorized parties, executed according to procedures that had the force of law. The shame of losing control was doubled. First, the actual loss of authority over property you had maintained for decades. Second, the knowledge that the loss happened through legal mechanisms that made it look like you had consented, that you had been incompetent or irresponsible, that the transfer was for your own good. This was the world where the mansion's story unfolded. A world where protection and appropriation used the same language, where legal authority could be manufactured through documents, and where the person whose name was on the deed could find himself erased from the property's future by people claiming to save it. The man who owned the mansion had not built it, but had inherited it with a sense of responsibility that shaped his entire life. He came from a family that had occupied the property for 3 generations, a family whose identity was intertwined with the estate in ways that made separation unthinkable. His father had maintained it through economic depressions that had forced other families to sell. His grandfather had expanded it during years of prosperity, adding wings and gardens that made it one of the region's notable properties. The mansion was not merely valuable real estate, it was the physical manifestation of family continuity, proof that their position in the community was permanent rather than contingent. He learned early that maintaining such a property required more than wealth. It required constant attention, strategic management, and a willingness to subordinate personal desires to the property's needs. Roofs had to be replaced on schedules that could not be delayed. Heating systems required updating as technology changed. Taxes climbed every year as local governments reassessed values. Staff had to be hired and supervised. Gardens had to be maintained to standards that reflected the family's position. The property consumed capital at a rate that required careful financial management and multiple income streams to sustain. He was competent at this work. He understood that preserving the estate meant managing it as a business rather than simply living in it as a home. He rented portions of the property for events. He opened the gardens for charity functions that generated goodwill and tax benefits. He negotiated with local government about historic designation, understanding that formal recognition could provide protections even as it imposed restrictions. He cultivated relationships with preservation societies, historical organizations, and community leaders who saw the mansion as an asset to the region. But competence created its own vulnerability. The more essential he made himself to the property's operation, the more dependent others became on his continued function. The staff relied on his management to maintain their employment. The community relied on his stewardship to keep the property accessible and preserved. Family members who might inherit relied on his ability to maintain value. And when his capacity to manage began to weaken, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, as age and health created limitations, those who depended on him began to see his continued control as a threat rather than an asset. He made mistakes that seemed minor at the time but that would later be weaponized against him. He trusted people who offered to help with paperwork, not recognizing that every signature he provided was creating a record that could be used to establish patterns of dependency or incapacity. He accepted assistance from family members and advisors without documenting the limits of their authority. He allowed others to speak for him in situations where precise legal language mattered, not understanding that informal arrangements could be formalized in ways he never authorized. The turning point came when his health declined enough to require assistance with daily management, but not enough to trigger obvious incapacity. This gray zone, where he remained mentally competent but physically limited, where he could make decisions but needed help executing them, created opportunities for those who wanted control to gradually expand their authority. They began helping by taking on more tasks, by signing documents on his behalf, by making decisions that seemed operational but that established precedents about who actually controlled the property. He was dangerous not because he intended harm but because he represented an obstacle. As long as he retained legal control, decisions about the mansion's future remained his to make. But his age and condition meant that control would eventually pass, and multiple parties had competing visions for what should happen. Some family members wanted to inherit and convert the property to uses that would generate income. Others wanted it preserved but transferred to institutions that would maintain it as he had. Local preservation groups wanted guarantees it would never be sold or subdivided. And moving quietly behind all these interests were advisors who understood that whoever controlled the paperwork would ultimately determine the outcome. His greatest vulnerability was his attachment to the property itself. He could not imagine losing it. And because he could not imagine it, he failed to protect against it adequately. He assumed that his ownership was secure, that his decades of stewardship had created claims that could not be undone. He did not understand, not until it was too late, that legal control is not the same as moral claim, and that the system he trusted to protect his interests could be turned against him by people who knew how to work it better than he did. The first real crisis came not with drama but with a signature that would later be contested. He had been ill, nothing life-threatening, but enough to require hospitalization and a recovery period during which he could not manage daily affairs. During this time, one of his advisors secured a power of attorney, presented as a temporary measure to ensure bills were paid and operations continued smoothly. The document was signed in his hospital room, witnessed by staff who later said he seemed alert and understanding. But others would claim he was medicated, confused, that he did not fully grasp what he was authorizing. The power of attorney was broader than necessary for simple bill paying. It granted authority over financial decisions, property transactions, legal matters, essentially transferring control while leaving ownership nominally in his name. The advisor who secured it insisted this was standard, that comprehensive authority was needed to handle unexpected situations, that limiting the scope would create problems if urgent decisions were required. The explanation sounded reasonable. The document was filed properly. And for several months, nothing seemed wrong. Then came the first contested decision. The advisor, claiming authority under the power of attorney, made a significant financial commitment without consulting him. A loan against the property to cover what was described as urgent repairs and tax obligations. When he learned about it and objected, he was told the decision had been necessary, that he had been unavailable for consultation, that the power of attorney authorized exactly this kind of action. He tried to revoke the authority, but the advisor claimed the revocation was invalid because it came during a period when his capacity was questionable due to medication and stress. The incident created factions. Some family members supported him, arguing the advisor had overstepped. Others supported the advisor, arguing that someone needed to make hard decisions he was avoiding. Legal opinions were sought, each side finding experts who supported their position. The dispute moved from private argument to legal filing, from family matter to public record. And once it entered the court system, the mansion itself became something different, not a home but an asset in litigation, not private property but a matter of judicial concern. The court proceedings exposed mechanisms he had not understood existed. His capacity became a legal question rather than a personal matter, assessed through evaluations and testimony that treated his life as evidence. His signatures on various documents over recent years were analyzed by experts who claimed to detect patterns of dependency or confusion. His medical records were subpoenaed and examined for signs that his judgment had been impaired. Every decision he had made, every document he had signed, became potential evidence in a case about whether he should retain control of property he had managed successfully for decades. The shame of this process was profound. His competence, his judgment, his very selfhood became matters of legal dispute, discussed in courtrooms by lawyers who presented him as either a vulnerable elder requiring protection or a competent owner defending his rights, depending on which characterization served their client's interests. The local press covered the proceedings with attention that suggested community fascination with the spectacle of a prominent family in conflict. Neighbors who had known him for years began to avoid him, uncertain whether engaging would somehow involve them in the legal battle. The crisis forged a method among those who wanted to transfer control, manufacture documentation of incapacity, establish patterns of poor judgment, create a record that would justify intervention. Every time he made a decision they disagreed with, it became evidence of impaired judgment. Every time he resisted their recommendations, it became evidence of stubbornness that threatened the property. The system that was supposed to protect vulnerable people from exploitation was being used to justify taking control from someone whose primary vulnerability was trusting people who claimed to help him. The court eventually ruled narrowly. The power of attorney was valid but had been exceeded in specific instances. The advisor was required to account for decisions made and face restrictions on future authority. But the damage was done. The litigation had created a public record of disputes about his capacity. It had established that others could question his authority and be taken seriously by courts. And it had taught everyone involved that the path to controlling the mansion ran through legal proceedings that could strip his authority while appearing to protect his interests. The first crisis seemed to end with his victory. But it was the kind of victory that revealed vulnerability, that showed those who wanted control exactly how to take it. The mansion had never been just a building. It was a mechanism for preserving social position through physical permanence. What the property offered its owner was identity made visible. To live there was to occupy a specific place in local hierarchy, to be someone whose presence was assumed in certain contexts, whose opinion was sought on matters affecting the community, whose family's continuity was proved by occupying a space their ancestors had occupied. The mansion functioned as a kind of credential that did not require constant renewal. Unlike wealth that could be lost or positions that could be eliminated, the property simply existed, and existing was enough to maintain status. This made the property valuable in ways that exceeded its market price. Selling it would have generated significant capital, but that capital could not purchase what the property provided: the suggestion of permanence, the appearance of stability, the claim to belong to a class whose position predated current circumstances. For someone whose identity was built on family legacy, losing the mansion meant losing more than real estate. It meant admitting that the continuity had broken, that the family story was ending rather than continuing. But this value was also vulnerability. Because the property meant so much to him, because he could not imagine voluntarily relinquishing it, he was willing to make sacrifices to keep it that others would not make. He deferred personal expenses to pay property taxes. He accepted limitations on how he could use portions of the estate in exchange for historic designation and tax benefits. He opened the property to community use even when it was intrusive and expensive. Each compromise seemed small, each accommodation seemed reasonable. But collectively, they established that the property existed for purposes beyond his personal use, that the community and history had claims on it that rivaled his own. The key was understanding that he valued the property not as a financial asset but as an identity mechanism. This meant that arguments framed in financial terms, that maintaining it was too expensive, that selling would be prudent, that converting to more productive use would be wise, had no purchase with him. But arguments framed in terms of preservation, of legacy, of ensuring the property survived for future generations, these resonated deeply. And so those who wanted to transfer control learned to speak his language, to present their objectives as aligned with his deepest values, to argue that taking the property from him was actually the best way to protect what he cared about most. The mechanism for this transfer was the charitable foundation, presented as a solution that would preserve the mansion permanently, protect it from being sold or divided, ensure professional management, and maintain public access. The foundation would take ownership, but he would retain lifetime occupancy and significant input into operations. His name would be honored. His legacy would be protected. The property would survive in perpetuity rather than being vulnerable to whatever future heirs might decide. The proposal was framed as addressing problems that were real. He was aging. He had no children. His likely heirs had different relationships to the property. Some wanted to keep it, others wanted to sell. None had demonstrated the capacity to maintain it at the standards he had maintained. Without some arrangement, the property's future after his death was genuinely uncertain. The foundation seemed to solve these problems while honoring his commitment to preservation. But the fine print told a different story. Transferring ownership to the foundation meant losing control over decisions that mattered. The board would determine how the property was used, what events occurred there, which parts remained private and which became public. His lifetime occupancy was subject to conditions about his behavior and the property's needs, conditions the board could interpret. His input into operations was advisory rather than binding. And crucially, once the transfer was complete, it was irreversible. If he later changed his mind or if the foundation operated differently than promised, he would have no recourse. The people proposing the solution presented themselves as allies protecting his legacy. They were preservation experts, foundation professionals, community leaders who shared his commitment to maintaining the property. They spoke his language, understood his values, framed the transfer as fulfilling his life's work rather than ending it. They provided legal opinions explaining how the structure would work, financial projections showing it was sustainable, testimonials from other property owners who had made similar arrangements and been satisfied. What they did not explain clearly, perhaps because they did not recognize it themselves, or perhaps because acknowledging it would have undermined the proposal, was that the arrangement meant he would spend his remaining years occupying a property he no longer controlled, living in a house that belonged to an institution, experiencing daily the difference between ownership and tenancy even if the legal language avoided that term. The property would survive. But he would survive in it as something less than what he had been, no longer the owner who had maintained it for decades but the former owner granted permission to remain until his death, after which the institution would completely remake the property according to its needs rather than his wishes. The big idea was simple: preservation through appropriation. take the property from the person who had kept it, transfer it to an institution that would never die and never sell, present the transfer as honoring rather than erasing him. It worked because it told him what he wanted to hear, that the property would be safe, while hiding what he did not want to know, that making it safe required removing him from its future. The mansion itself was designed for a kind of life that no longer existed but that he insisted on maintaining. The entrance hall set expectations immediately. High ceilings, wood paneling darkened by a century of polish, a staircase that rose with the kind of craftsmanship that announced itself through proportion rather than ornament. The space was meant to receive guests in a manner that established hierarchy, the residents standing at a position of advantage, visitors entering into a space that was controlled and impressive. In an earlier era, this kind of entrance had functional purpose, separating those who belonged from those who were merely visiting. But by the time these events were unfolding, such formal receiving was anachronistic, a performance of social structures that had largely collapsed. Yet he maintained it. Visitors were received in the entrance hall by staff who had been with the household for decades, who understood the rituals even if guests found them strange. There was a procedure for arriving, for being announced, for being led to whichever room was appropriate to the visit's purpose. The formality was not affectation. It was his attempt to preserve a way of life that the mansion had been built to enable, to insist through daily practice that the old structures still mattered even as the world around them moved on. The rooms beyond the entrance hall told the story of his priorities. The formal drawing room was maintained in museum condition, period furniture, historic artwork, everything preserved as it had been during the mansion's early decades. This room was rarely used for actual living but was essential for the events where he opened the property to the public, for the tours that preservation groups occasionally conducted, for the documentation that supported the property's historic designation. The room was proof that he was a responsible steward, that the property was being preserved rather than merely occupied. But the private quarters told a different story. The rooms where he actually lived showed the compromises of maintaining a property this scale with declining resources. Furniture that should have been reupholstered remained shabby because the cost was prohibitive and the rooms were not seen by outsiders. Heating was limited to occupied areas to control expenses, leaving much of the mansion cold. Repairs were prioritized based on visibility. Anything guests might see was maintained impeccably, but infrastructure failures in private areas were patched rather than properly fixed. He lived in a fraction of the house's space, keeping the public areas perfect while his actual living conditions deteriorated. The grounds were similarly divided. The gardens and lawns visible from the road were maintained by a reduced staff working longer hours, preserving appearances while the areas behind the house showed neglect. The greenhouse that had once been the property's pride was closed because heating it was too expensive. Outbuildings were locked and left to decay because he lacked resources to maintain them and feared that visible deterioration would trigger intervention from preservation authorities. The most revealing space was his study, a room lined with ledgers and files documenting decades of property management. Every repair, every expense, every negotiation with tax authorities, every arrangement with preservation groups, all documented in his careful handwriting. The study was where he spent most of his time, managing the property from a desk covered with paperwork that never seemed to diminish. Staff describe him as obsessed with the files, constantly reviewing past decisions, preparing documentation of his stewardship as if he knew he would eventually need to prove his competence. The mansion also held the infrastructure of control. The safe where important documents were kept, deeds, wills, contracts, secured with combinations that he changed regularly, trusting no one with access. The telephone in his study that he answered himself, refusing to allow staff to screen calls because he feared missing something important. The locked drawer where he kept correspondence with lawyers and advisors, organized chronologically, every letter filed as potential evidence. But this infrastructure of control revealed its own vulnerability. The safe could protect documents from theft, but not from legal orders requiring their production. The telephone gave him direct communication, but also meant every call was an opportunity for someone to say they had spoken with him when they had not, to claim he had agreed to things he had not agreed to. The files documenting his competence could be read differently by those looking for evidence of decline. The obsessive organization could be presented as paranoia, the careful documentation as inability to delegate, the isolation as evidence he could no longer manage relationships necessary for proper stewardship. The mansion had become a trap disguised as a sanctuary. It protected him from the world but also isolated him from allies who might have helped him resist what was coming. It demonstrated his commitment but also proved how much he would sacrifice to keep it. And it gave those who wanted control a powerful weapon, the claim that the property's needs exceeded his capacity, that preservation required professional management he could no longer provide, that protecting the mansion meant protecting it from him. The household operated according to routines designed to maintain the appearance of normalcy while managing the reality of decline. Staff who had worked at the mansion for decades described an environment of increasing tension in the years before the final legal battle. The owner was present and active, but his authority was being quietly contested by advisors and family members who claimed to be helping but who increasingly made decisions without consulting him. The household became a space where competing authorities operated simultaneously, the owner giving instructions that were sometimes followed and sometimes ignored, advisors issuing directions that contradicted his, family members appearing and disappearing with their own agendas. Access to the owner became a controlled commodity. Where he had once been relatively available to staff and visitors, layers of gatekeeping emerged. Phone calls were screened by advisors who determined which required his attention. Visitors were assessed by family members who decided whether meetings would be productive. His mail was sometimes opened before reaching him, with certain correspondence being handled by others who claimed to be protecting him from stress or confusion. Each restriction was framed as protective, but collectively they isolated him from direct contact with people who might have supported his independence. Former staff described specific incidents that revealed the machinery of appropriation in operation. A meeting where the owner expressed clear preferences about property management, only to have an advisor later claim he had been confused and had meant the opposite. A document brought for his signature with explanations that emphasized urgency and minimized significance, where he signed without fully understanding implications. Conversations where he asked direct questions and received answers that were technically true but misleading, designed to secure agreement to proposals he would have rejected if he had understood them completely. The staff's own position became increasingly precarious. They were hired by the owner and theoretically reported to him, but they were being directed by advisors who controlled the finances that determined their continued employment. Some staff tried to maintain loyalty to him, reporting to him when decisions were being made without his knowledge. But these loyal staff members found themselves pressured to resign or fired for being uncooperative. The staff who remained were those who understood that survival meant following the directions of whoever actually controlled the household, regardless of who legally owned it. The mansion's daily rhythms became theatre designed to support competing narratives. For visitors from preservation groups or local government, the property appeared well managed, the owner reasonably competent, everything functioning smoothly. But privately, different stories were being constructed. Accounts of his increasing inability to manage, incidents of confusion or poor judgment, concerns about the property's future if he remained in control. These private stories were being documented, recorded, prepared for eventual use in legal proceedings. Contemporary accounts suggest the owner recognized what was happening but struggled to respond effectively. He tried to reassert control by firing advisors, but they claimed he lacked authority to terminate them or that his instructions came during periods of incapacity. He tried to document his own competence through detailed memos and correspondence, but these efforts were later presented as evidence of paranoia or obsessive behavior inconsistent with sound judgment. He tried to build alliances with family members and community leaders, but found that most were reluctant to involve themselves in what was increasingly seen as a legal matter best left to courts and lawyers. The few people who maintained clear loyalty describe a man who understood he was being systematically undermined but who lacked effective tools to stop it. His ownership was legal, but his authority was practical, and practical authority was being transferred through mechanisms he could not counter without appearing difficult, unstable, or incompetent. Every attempt to resist was framed as evidence of exactly the incapacity being alleged. Every insistence on his rights was treated as abstinence rather than legitimate defense. The machine worked by turning his strengths into weaknesses. His commitment to the property became evidence he was too emotionally attached to make rational decisions. His detailed record-keeping became evidence of obsessive behavior. His refusal to accept recommendations became evidence of poor judgment. The very things that had made him an effective steward for decades were reframed as signs of decline that justified intervention. And through all this, the mansion itself stood unchanged, beautiful, historic, perfectly maintained in its public spaces. The conflict was invisible to visitors who came for events or tours. The property appeared to be exactly what it was supposed to be, a well-preserved historic estate. What they could not see was that preservation was being purchased through the systematic erasure of the person who had made that preservation possible. The decisive moment came during a formal gathering that appeared to be a celebration but functioned as a trap. The occasion was presented as honoring his decades of stewardship, a dinner at the mansion attended by preservation leaders, local officials, family members, and the foundation board that had been established to eventually take ownership. The evening was designed to look like recognition, to feel like validation. There were speeches praising his commitment. There were toasts to his legacy. The atmosphere was warm, appreciative, constructed to make him feel valued and understood. But embedded in the celebration was the final mechanism of transfer. Among the papers brought for his review that evening, casually, as if administrative details that accompanied any major event, were documents that completed the property's transfer to the foundation. The language was complex, the pages numerous, the explanations technical. He was told these were the formalities necessary to finalize arrangements he had already agreed to in principle, that his signature was needed to complete the process everyone had been working toward for months. He signed. Later, he would claim he had not fully understood what he was authorizing, that the significance had been minimized, that he had been pressured in a moment when refusing would have been socially devastating. But the documents were witnessed, properly executed, filed with the court. And once filed, they were nearly impossible to undo. The foundation owned the mansion. He retained lifetime occupancy but not control. The transfer was complete. The win, for those who had orchestrated it, was total. They had secured the property for preservation permanently. They had done so with his signature, which meant the transfer appeared voluntary rather than coerced. They had managed the process in a manner that looked honorable, celebrating him publicly while privately stripping his authority. And they had structured the arrangement so that challenging it would require him to prove he had been incompetent or deceived at the moment of signing, which would damage his reputation and undermine the very legacy he was trying to protect. The loss, for him, became clear over the following weeks. The foundation's board began making decisions about the property without consulting him. Staff were told they now reported to the foundation rather than to him personally. Areas of the mansion he had considered private were declared available for foundation use. Events were scheduled without his input. His role transformed from owner to resident, from decision-maker to person whose preferences were considered but not binding. He tried to reverse the transfer. He hired lawyers and filed challenges arguing the signature had been obtained through misrepresentation, that he had lacked capacity due to medication and stress, that undue influence had been exerted. But the foundation's lawyers responded with documentation, medical evaluations showing he had been competent, witness testimony confirming he had seemed to understand what he was signing, his own prior statements about wanting the property preserved in exactly the manner the foundation was committed to preserving it. The court proceedings were devastating. His entire life became evidence, his financial decisions scrutinized for patterns of impairment, his relationships examined for signs of isolation or manipulation, his behavior analyzed for indicators of capacity or incapacity. The process took months, during which he continued living in the mansion but with diminishing authority over it, experiencing daily the reality of occupying a space he no longer controlled. The final ruling came with language that attempted sympathy but delivered destruction. The court found that while the process had been aggressive and the timing opportunistic, the transfer was legally valid. He had signed the documents. He had been competent to do so. That he later regretted the decision did not make it invalid. That he claimed to have been pressured did not rise to the level of duress that would void the transaction. The foundation was the rightful owner. He retained occupancy rights but nothing more. The shame of this outcome was multilayered. He had been legally defeated by institutions claiming to honor him. He had been determined competent in order to bind him to a decision he insisted he had been incompetent to make. He had lost control of property he had maintained for decades through a signature obtained during an event celebrating his stewardship. The peak of recognition had contained the seed of destruction. The moment of maximum public honor was the moment when private authority was finally, irreversibly, transferred away. The aftermath revealed how systematically his identity had been separated from the property's future. Within months of the transfer becoming final, the foundation began remaking the mansion according to its institutional needs. His personal possessions were required to be removed from public areas to prepare for expanded tours. His private quarters were reduced to a smaller footprint to accommodate foundation offices and storage. The routines he had maintained for decades were eliminated in favor of operations designed for a house museum rather than a residence. The foundation's messaging about the property carefully managed his presence. Press releases announcing new programs thank him for his generous donation of the property. Language that suggested voluntary gift rather than contested transfer. Materials for visitors mentioned his family's historical connection but emphasized the property's architectural and historical significance rather than personal stories. His name appeared in acknowledgments but not prominently, and always in past tense, recognizing what he had done rather than who he was. Local preservationists, who had initially supported the transfer as protecting the property, began to express private discomfort about what they witnessed. They saw him moving through the mansion he had maintained for decades with visible confusion about his status, uncertain whether he needed permission to enter certain rooms, hesitant to object to changes that he clearly found painful. But publicly, these same preservationists defended the transfer, arguing that difficult as it was personally for him, it had achieved the goal of permanent preservation. The legal and preservation communities, observing the case, drew conclusions that would influence how similar situations were handled subsequently. The case demonstrated that property transfers could be accomplished through strategic use of foundations even when owners were resistant, that timing and social pressure could secure signatures that might not otherwise be obtained, that courts would uphold transactions as long as procedural requirements were met regardless of whether the outcome seemed just. The mechanisms that had worked here would be refined and repeated elsewhere. But the greatest betrayal was still coming. As the foundation consolidated control and the owner's health continued declining, questions arose about what would happen after his death. The foundation's board discussed whether his name should remain attached to the property, whether future visitors should hear stories about the person who had kept it or only about the architecture and history. The discussion revealed fundamental tension. The foundation valued the property but saw the person as complication rather than asset, as someone whose contested transfer created awkward explanations rather than inspiring narrative. The decision, when it came, was presented as practical rather than vindictive. The property would be marketed simply by its historic name and architectural significance. The family connection would be mentioned but not emphasized. The tours would focus on the building's construction and period, rather than the people who had lived there. The owner's personal story, his decades of stewardship, his sacrifice to maintain it, even his contested loss of it, would be minimized or omitted as not central to the visitor experience the foundation wanted to create. This was erasure accomplished through editorial choice. Not destroying his legacy actively but simply declining to emphasize it, allowing it to fade through selective storytelling that focused on architecture over people, on building over builder, on preservation over the person who had preserved. The house would survive but the man would vanish, remembered only in archives that few would consult, present only in the legal records that documented his defeat. Former staff, family members who had opposed the transfer, and local residents who remembered him as he had been before the legal battles, these people recognized the erasure for what it was. But they lacked mechanisms to counter it. The foundation controlled the narrative. The property was theirs to interpret. And interpretations that complicated the preservation story, that raised questions about how ownership had been transferred, that suggested the owner had been treated unjustly, these were not useful to an institution that needed donors and community support. The vanishing was accomplished not through dramatic destruction but through quiet marginalization. His name appeared in footnotes. His story became a minor detail. His identity separated from the property he had devoted his life to maintaining. And the shame that had driven the original transfer, shame about his capacity, shame about his judgment, shame about his alleged inability to protect the property adequately, became permanent, embedded in the institution's founding narrative about property saved from owner who could not be trusted with its future. The mansion survived. But what survived was a building emptied of the meaning its owner had tried to give it. The preservation was real. But so was the theft, accomplished through legal mechanisms, justified through concern about stewardship, hidden behind language of protection and permanence. Stand in the mansion today and you will hear a story carefully constructed to avoid uncomfortable truths. The tour guides describe the architecture with expertise and enthusiasm. They explain the period details, the craftsmanship, the historical context of construction. They mention the families who live there, usually in general terms that avoid specifics about conflict or contested ownership. The narrative is polished, professional, designed to make visitors feel they are experiencing preserved history rather than witnessing the scene of systematic appropriation. The owner's name appears in the materials, but in ways that minimize his agency and erase his loss. He is described as someone who helped preserve the property or who arranged for its transfer to the foundation. The language suggests collaboration rather than coercion, gift rather than appropriation, voluntary participation in preservation rather than involuntary removal from control. A visitor unfamiliar with the actual history would have no reason to question this narrative. It sounds noble, a family that built and maintained a property making arrangements to ensure its permanent preservation. The legal files that document the reality tell a different story, but these files are not part of the public tour. They exist in court archives, in the Foundation's private records, in the possession of lawyers who represented various parties. They contain the medical evaluations that were used to question his capacity, the testimony from advisors who claimed he needed protection, the financial analyses that suggested he could not maintain the property adequately, the final court ruling that validated the transfer while acknowledging the process had been difficult. What the files also contain, for anyone who examines them carefully, is evidence of a man fighting to retain control of something he understood better than those who took it from him. His memos explaining his management decisions are detailed and rational. His objections to the transfer are articulate and legally informed. His challenges to the proceedings are grounded in legitimate concerns about process and capacity determinations. The record shows not an incompetent elder requiring protection but a competent owner being systematically undermined by people who wanted what he had and knew how to use legal mechanisms to take it. The mansion endures as the foundation's showcase property, well maintained, publicly accessible, preserved in excellent condition. The foundation points to it as evidence of successful stewardship, as validation of the model where historic properties are transferred to professional management rather than left to uncertain inheritance. Preservation conferences use it as a case study. Other property owners considering similar arrangements are brought to see it as an example of what can be achieved. But walk through with someone who remembers what happened and you hear a different story. They point out the room where the decisive signatures were obtained. The office where he spent his final years under conditions he experienced as imprisonment in his own home. The areas that were his private space but that now serve institutional functions. The gardens he maintained at personal sacrifice that now bear plaques crediting the foundation rather than him. Every space contains a ghost, the presence of someone erased from the place he tried to make permanent. The current staff know only the sanitized version. They were hired by the foundation, trained in the official narrative, given talking points that emphasize preservation success. They believe they are working in a place that was saved, not a place where someone was systematically dispossessed. Their innocence is genuine, but it enables the erasure, allowing the institution to operate without constantly confronting the human cost of its founding. Local residents who remember him have complicated feelings. They appreciate that the mansion was preserved. It is an asset to the community, a source of pride, a connection to history. But they also remember a man who was treated in ways that make the preservation feel tainted, who was humiliated through legal processes that made his competence a matter of public debate, who lost control of what he had maintained with such dedication. The ambivalence is rarely expressed openly because criticizing the foundation feels like attacking preservation itself. This is the final victory of those who orchestrated the transfer. They have made questioning the process seem like opposing preservation. They have structured the narrative so that defending the owner requires appearing to want the property sold or destroyed. They have made his erasure seem like the inevitable price of something valuable. And they have done this so thoroughly that even people who recognize the injustice struggle to articulate it without sounding like they oppose the outcome everyone agrees was important. The house stands. The name fades. And the question that should be asked, what exactly was preserved when the person was erased, is not asked because asking it threatens the story that makes the preservation feel triumphant rather than troubling. If you return to the mansion today, walk up the same entrance where he received visitors, enter the rooms he maintained with such care, you will be welcomed as a tourist, a visitor to a preserved historic site. But try to find him in the story being told. Try to hear his voice in the narrative. Try to understand what it felt like to maintain this property for decades only to have it taken through mechanisms that made the appropriation look like salvation. You will find architecture. You will find history. You will find preservation. What you will not find is adequate accounting of how preservation was purchased, or from whom, or at what cost beyond the financial. The questions that linger in the elegant rooms are these. If a house is saved by removing its owner, is that preservation? Or is it theft with better language, appropriation disguised as protection, dispossession presented as rescue? When paperwork becomes a weapon, when powers of attorney and foundation transfers and capacity evaluations can be wielded to strip authority from someone who built their entire life around maintaining something, who is allowed to speak for that life? Who decides what counted, what mattered, what should be remembered? And if the name is erased from the place, if the story is rewritten to minimize the person and emphasize the building, if the institution controls the narrative and the narrative serves the institution's needs rather than historical truth, what exactly are we preserving? Are we protecting history? Or are we creating a new mythology that flatters our institutions while hiding how they acquire what they claim to protect? The mansion that ate its master stands as monument to an uncomfortable possibility, that the legal systems designed to protect property and people can be turned against both, that the language of preservation and protection can mask appropriation, that institutions claiming public benefit can function as sophisticated mechanisms of private dispossession. The house survived by betraying its owner. And that betrayal has been so thoroughly incorporated into the institution's founding narrative that it has become invisible, Not denied, just never quite acknowledged, present in the record but absent from the story. Stand in the entrance hall today and the silence tells you everything. The house is full of visitors, full of explanation, full of carefully curated history. But somewhere in that fullness is an absence, the voice of someone who loved this place and lost it, who fought to keep it and failed, who signed papers he was told would protect his legacy only to discover they erased him from it. The shame he felt, the shame that was weaponized to justify taking his property, the shame that now clings to anyone who questions whether the preservation was worth its human cost, that shame is the mansion's final secret, the one thing that has been perfectly preserved even as everything else was carefully managed and presented and explained. The house stands. The man is gone. And we tour one while forgetting the other, preserving architecture while erasing the human story that should make us question whether we know the difference between protection and plunder.